What if I told you good girl syndrome might be the thing that's keeping you stuck, even if you don't consider yourself a good girl? Let's talk about it. Now listen, I would have never described myself as a good girl. I'm outspoken, loud even, very justice oriented. I'm clearly openly somewhat unconventional. I don't consider myself a people pleaser. And guess what? I have still been operating like a good girl. See, most of the time, folks equate good girl syndrome with people pleasing. And while that is a part of it, I believe there's more to it. I believe that good girl syndrome can impact all the ways we make choices, how we move, and our relationship with responsibility. So if you've been circling a decision and trying to figure out the most responsible way to move and nothing quite feels right, stick around. The thing blocking you could be good girl syndrome. You're listening to Seen with Serena Kumara, a podcast all about the journey of coming home to ourselves. The unlearning, the remembering, and the returning to what's always been true about who we are and what we deserve. Good girl syndrome is the result of the behaviors and traits that are taught to and reinforced in girls in specific. Most of us think of them being things like being sweet and doing what you're told, being obedient, being polite, even being quiet. But on a deeper level, it's really about being emotionally manageable, being acceptable, being contained, easy to approve of, and easily explained. Okay? Those things are taught to us by our caregivers and authority figures, and then reinforced just through greater society, the media, things we see, so on and so forth. So then it becomes this pattern, which is really just conditioning, because the behavior is taught, then the behavior is praised, and then all the little girls around you have the same behavior. So it seems normal. So then the norm gets passed on, and none of us are asking where this came from. And most of us aren't paying attention to the fact that the boys aren't getting it the same way. On top of that, it's very hard for us to pinpoint that this is a pattern reserved specifically for women and girls, because it's not described that way. It's really described as the right thing to do, right? Moral behavior, being responsible, humility. There's an exception that there are things that are presented to us for being a good woman. A lot of us realize way later that these are not lessons or values that are really pushed on boys in the same way. We know that this conditioning is a result of gender expectations and respectability politics. It's often a result of what's required for class mobility, right? Your ability to move up, which is what the American dream. And that's kind of for everybody. Now, there are subcultures, cultures within cultures, where you have the societal good girl conditioning, but packed on top of it is the rules of your specific community, cultural group, or even class level. I guess we'll say class category. Meaning, essentially, based on where we come from, our good girl conditioning can look different or heavier than someone else's. And with that, there is absolutely a layer of this conditioning that is connected to safety. Because not only were these stereotypes of what was expected of women, these are the behaviors that were accepted from women. And if you were outside of that, that could become very unsafe for you. And while these conditions have not been completely eradicated, they have largely improved, but we are still taught these behaviors as if they are the same necessities. So often, the women who loved us really went hard with that reinforcement because they wanted us to be not only safe and later on, once we had some rights to work or build something, successful. So sometimes we're more than discouraged from being emotional. We're essentially forbidden from it because you don't want to be labeled as crazy or difficult. There were some times that could get you picked up and put somewhere, and now it can keep you from getting opportunities. So just shut the whole thing down. You better operate in excellence and don't let anybody see you as any kind of a problem. You need to be very easy so that you cannot be dismissed. And you need to be responsible so that people cannot call you lazy or reckless or unstable or any of the things, because reputation is not just reputation. Reputation can be everything. And those sorts of things only increase when you talk about being Black or a woman of color. Being polite was sometimes a matter of life and death. It was sometimes the difference between getting one golden opportunity or existing in lifelong poverty. Like, it was that serious. And that sort of thing was passed down through generations, even as things improved, even as we had more rights and more autonomy, without explaining or even remembering sometimes that this came from survival during Reconstruction or the early 1900s and so on. And I think that's an important nuance because assimilating to those expectations has often protected us and it has helped us move through systems in relative safety. But when we don't understand what things really are or where they come from, we can't be in healthy relationship with them. Like, if you understand, oh, this is not actually the only responsible way to do things like I was taught. This is really good girl behavior that I was taught to embrace as a survival tactic. And I can choose to use it or not use it, but at least I know what it is, as opposed to seeing it as the only way to be right. Because that distinction is what impacts the way we move. And that conditioning doesn't just impact some of our behavior, it impacts the way we think holistically. And therefore, it impacts the way we make decisions and ultimately the way we move. One thing this trains us to do is seek approval, either consciously or subconsciously. So when we're making choices about our lives, about our desires, and how to get them, or whether or not we even will attempt to, we're often weighing our decisions against what will be approved of by the people who taught us the good girl pattern, right? The people who love us, our parents, our authority figures, our caregivers, right? But sometimes the approval we're seeking is from greater society, whether we realize it or not. Sometimes that approval is from the system. When we're looking at what the responsible choice would be or the right choice would be, in the back of our mind, whether we see it or not, we're measuring it against respectability and tradition and expectations and norms and so many other things. And that doesn't necessarily automatically stop when we are consciously rejecting the system. And I know that to be true for myself. I have sometimes allowed it to thwart my out of the box thinking, where I'll have this idea or this aha epiphany moment of a plan. And the first thing I'll do is sort of Google if it's possible or what has been done before or how to do it. And I know that that is connected to seeking to align myself with norms, which is still kind of connected to looking for that approval. So while I don't consider myself a direct people pleaser in that I'm very self-sacrificial in relationships or constantly putting someone else's needs ahead of mine, I do believe I am what I consider an indirect people pleaser, where I'm not consciously trying to make my decisions for the approval of a single person or to make anyone outside of myself in specific happy. But I am trying to do things in ways that seem reasonable and acceptable or even sensible to what I would consider either an invisible audience or like a ghost audience, which is another thing where you're not consciously thinking, what would my mother say about this every time you do something? But the voice in the back of your mind that is telling you that that's irresponsible or that's not the way we do things is someone else's. And I wanted to make this episode for women like me, folks who consider themselves conscious and bold and even tapped into what I consider a sacred selfishness, but are still operating with some approval consciousness in their decision making, because girls like us miss this and it keeps us one step further from our freedom. What we may not realize is good girl syndrome keeps us stuck because it gives us a very specific vision of what movement is allowed to look like. It gives us a very rigid definition of responsible that often means careful, easily explainable, selfless, previously proven, and aligned with values and principles that you specifically have not necessarily agreed to, but we societally have. And when you are a bold, revolutionary, earth-changing woman like us, sometimes our moves require speed, disruption, visibility, a lack of humility, self-interest, or risk. It requires for us to be the first ones to do it that way, or the first ones to remember to do it the old way. And that requires for us to trust our knowing, even if we do not get approval. And because women like us often do not recognize ourselves in the people-pleasing descriptions. I'm going to go through some examples of what it might look like for you so that if you see yourself, you can make the changes as you see fit. The first one is confusing self-abandonment for fairness. That's not the same as people-pleasing to be accommodating. This is about overcorrecting in the direction that does not favor yourself, so you don't come across as taking too much or wanting too much or centering yourself too much. And that's for my justice-oriented girls right there. That impacts our movement because it's almost like we work against ourselves before it's even necessary. And it's because we view self-sacrifice as fair. This directly connects to the good girl syndrome trait of not taking up too much room and being self-sacrificing. And ultimately, this can slow us down or even cause us to lose opportunities because our first thought is, it might not be fair for me to take it. And before we go forward, because I want to be clear and I don't want to be repeating this over and over again through the episode, nuance is a thing. Most things are not black and white. There are obviously instances where what I'm describing as good girl syndrome could really just be being a good person and aligning with your morals. What matters and what changes is the driving force behind something. Use your discernment and your good sense to determine what I'm talking about. The second one is being silent or secretive until it works. Now, this is for my girls who are not necessarily afraid of doing things out of the box, but because of the fear, and I'm going to argue just a sprinkle of shame for your choice, you don't share it with anybody. And that is so that if I fail, don't nobody know, and I won't hear I told you so or hear people's mouths. Now, I do think that there's a place for that. I do think that energy is very real and having people speak on your plans is not always healthy. But the other side of that is sometimes we rob ourselves of support, and that flop that we're trying to avoid, we can low-key cause because we're not willing to be bold and open and proud of this new way we're doing things. It can also just feel lonely and put an extreme pressure on whatever the thing is being successful enough for it to justify your choice. And depending on how you define success, it becomes even heavier. And this connects to good girl syndrome because it's still connected to approval. It's saying, I don't expect to get approval at the beginning. And because that's unavailable to me, I'll just disconnect. The lack of approval runs everything. Number 3, making moves that are strictly self-serving feel morally wrong or even suspicious. I'm just going to say it. A lot of the things that we consider morally right or wrong don't have anything to do with harm, which is my differentiator when I think of good and bad or right or wrong. Am I harmed? Is anyone else harmed? A lot of times what we consider morally correct just has to do with conditioning that is not really here to serve us. And so a lot of us, especially good girls, are so discouraged from appearing selfish. Like that might be the loudest one of them all. And because of the way we are driven to look out for other people before ourselves, like that's the right thing to do, it can feel almost paralyzing. Like you can see this would be a good move for me. I want to do it. I can see how I can do it. And it just serves me. And there will be something in our minds or bodies that says that that's not good enough. And that's how it impacts our movement. Because it doesn't seem like a good enough choice just because it would serve us. So sometimes we delay or even dilute something. Like we'll sprinkle something else in there so it's good enough. If something is essentially just about our comfort or our freedom or our ease. Next, good girl syndrome can make it difficult for us to be real about our desires. We are conditioned about what's acceptable to want. And if we start to feel a pull towards something that's outside of that, we start to either call it something else, right? Like a guilty pleasure, or we start working against it without ever taking the time to understand that pull that I feel towards something. Is it actually unhealthy? Why do I feel like it's a bad thing? Oh, because it's going to be harmful to me or someone else. Okay, that makes sense. Or, well, this conditioning said that this is what's acceptable to me. And then that contributes to the way we move because that can be where it gets really dark and unhealthy. That can be where we start doing things to snuff out real soul desires through things like numbing, operating in like risky behaviors because we're trying to hide from ourselves. And just ultimately, it keeps us disconnected from ourselves, and being disconnected from you will always keep you from moving in the direction that is really right for you on a soul level. And the next one is what I call that mental loop that we sometimes have after we have made what we know is the right decision for us. Now, that one hits very close to home. I'm very connected to my intuition. I know her. I trust her. I move from her quite often. But where that conditioning shows up for me is the after, where I ruminate and I think and I worry, was it the right decision? And I'll meditate on it and I'll divine on it. And girl, you made that decision, and I'll feel bad and I'll wonder how somebody else is feeling, when in all reality, I cannot think of a time where I really moved from what I knew to be an intuitive nudge, especially as it pertains to partnerships and relationships, and regretted it later. In fact, every time that something said, girl, you know, this season is done, like disconnect from the job, disconnect from this partnership, and I've stayed for whatever reason, that's when the regret came in. But that doesn't stop me from thinking about who's impacted by that. Well, I hope they understand where I come from. That's where that approval, I hope that they understood where I was coming from. Unfortunately, one of the ways that I think that has impacted my movement is that I've stalled, because oftentimes one decision is supposed to support you in moving to the next one. And so when I choose to walk from something or walk towards something, and then I get in that position of doing that ruminating about, did I make the right decision? It can make the next move feel foggy. And so sometimes I make the next steps a little slower, and every so often a lot slower, which of course sometimes impacts the results. And those are just a few of what I would consider lesser recognized examples of how good girl syndrome shows up, even for those of us who don't consider ourselves good girls. I think unlearning this is a process for all of us. And one of the ways that we can do it is to ask ourselves certain questions when we're feeling stuck in our decision to make a leap or do something different. The first one is, would I be hesitating this much if I believed everyone would understand? This helps us to identify our perception and what it's based on, and whether what's holding us back is like the fear of being misunderstood or misjudged. When we are between two different approaches or options, and we're leaning towards one that doesn't feel like it's right, but it's viewed as more responsible, what makes this option responsible? And what definition of responsibility am I using? Where did it come from? And do I actually believe it? Because, honey, sometimes the good girl version of responsible really just means acceptable, explainable, and careful. For when you might be ruminating about an unpopular decision you made, you can ask, am I reopening this decision because something has changed or because I feel guilty? And lastly, whose rule am I following right now, and do I actually believe it? Because, baby, we internalize those rules and those expectations without ever considering where they came from or their purpose, and we don't even realize we're doing that. And before we get into this week's affirmation, I just want to remind you, good girl syndrome doesn't always look like being quiet and sweet and obviously people pleasing. For some of us, it looks like being wild in theory and in belief, but still subconsciously seeking approval. But that ain't how we change the world, my loves, and it's not how we change our lives. This week's affirmation is perfect. It's remember, you set your own standards. Make them higher. I love you. Thank you for being here. If you enjoyed this, please like, share, subscribe, send to a friend, and I will see you next week. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe, like, and drop a comment. And if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, follow the show, leave a review, and share it with someone you love. You can find me on Instagram at SeenWithSerena and at serenakumara.com. Until next time, be wildly, radically, and unapologetically good to yourself. Love you.